Glad you're all here. My name is Jeff Hines. I'm on staff at a church called Highland Community Church. We are a multi-site church and have been for a little while. Right now we have 4 sites, and tonight we're meeting actually with another free church to create a 5th site. It'll be our first shared site. We want to create a new model where 2 churches share a multi-site, actually for the purpose of going into rural Wisconsin. So my immediate context is I'm in a small city of 38,000. We also are in a small town of 900. We're in a town of 6,000. We're in a town of 8,000, and we're going to a town of 9,000. That would span a very large geographic region. I thought what I would do is just kind of walk you through what I do around here when we talk about multi-sites. It's my conviction first that the senior pastor has to create a initial pliable vision. I think if the senior pastor or executive pastor, however you would work in your context, does not have a really good vision, doesn't have to be perfect, it's pliable, but it doesn't have a good vision, it is dead on arrival. So we want to come into whatever our setting. In our setting, we have about a dozen pastors and another dozen directors. That would be my first group. But when I get there, I want a pretty good idea of what the vision is. They'll sharpen it, and from there, we'll take it to the elder board. They'll sharpen it, and we think in terms of concentric circles. So once we have the buy-in on the staff, we have the buy-in of the elder board, then I want the key placeholders. So if I'm going to another site, I've got to think in terms of those who run pro-presenter, those who run worship. We're still a Sunday school church, so I would need to have the buy-in of Sunday school, nursery, check-ins. We have pretty sophisticated stuff here. So I need all those leaders to buy in. I want to do that long before I'm standing in front of the congregation in the congregational meeting or sending out a letter. We're also going to create some kind of talk that is written down so that when we're communicating, we're all communicating the same thing. And as we're building concentric circles to shape future vision, we're also hearing questions. We're getting better. We're getting sharper. We're tweaking the pliable vision so that by the time we get to larger crowds, we probably have heard every question and we have pretty good answers as to why the Lord is leading us in this direction. So the first multi-site we created was about 10 years ago. We noticed that we had about 100 families coming from a community called Weston. We also noticed that they were really committed to our church and none of them were bringing their neighbors. They weren't bringing their neighbors because they were too far away. They were willing to come. They're very churched, so they're willing to make the drive. They might even be willing to share the gospel with their neighbors, but it wasn't realistic for their neighbors to come from Weston to our community in Wausau. And so I thought, well, what we're really doing is stealing the best and the brightest from Weston. We don't have other large evangelical churches in our area. They're all very good churches, but they're small. So we're actually taking the cream of the crop out of their community and we're not reaching Weston. So we thought we are going to try and plant a multi-site in Weston. A few things we did was we read the Multi-Site Revolution. It's probably 12 years old. I think it's still a good book. A friend of mine, Brian Berg, who pastors a church in Woodlands, he and I happened to be in California. We went to North Coast. We also took Larry Osborne out to lunch because we're both part of a a group that he leads, and we ask him lots and lots of questions. I went to several different multi-site churches and physically watched and had some of my coworkers go to some multi-site churches, and then we created our model. So we were sharpening ourselves long before we got to the point of sharing this vision. We also realistically looked at what it would cost us. For us, we decided it would be $100,000 in equipment, and it would be about $150,000 in terms of staffing and rent. That was what we determined it was going to cost. So we built that into the next budget. We also decided what elements of our DNA had to be transferable. For us, that was Sunday morning. It was also Sunday school. It was connection small groups. Those were the big rocks for us. Then on the advice of Larry Osborne, we said to the 100 families, this is what we're doing. We only want you to come if you want to do this. And he said to us, his first multi-site failed because what they said was, come for 1 year. And if you don't feel like you want to do it at the end of 1 year, go back to the main site. He said everybody went back to the main site and it collapsed. So we took that little advice and just said, hey, if you want to come, come. There was no end date. So some people, we got 50 of the 100 families trying it. 25 of them came back to the main campus. 25 of the families stuck. But the 25 who left over a period of about 12 months, coming back to the main campus. So we easily replaced them. If they had all come on the same date, we would have collapsed. So we learned that lesson from Larry Osborne. You don't say, can you give us 6 months? Can you give us a year? You just say, try it out. Some will give you a few weeks, some will give you a few months, some will stay indefinitely, but they're not all going to leave at the same point. A critical decision for us was who was going to be the campus pastor. I would tweak this quite a bit from what we did. The advice that was given to us was to get somebody who already knew our DNA. And so we took one of our pastors and made him the campus pastor. It seemed like a brilliant idea at the time, and he's a great guy. He's still the campus pastor there. But we have a different philosophy for number 2, 3, and 4. And that is we will always start with a worship pastor. If we're starting with 1 or 2, the worship pastor is the most dominant. And that's because of our philosophy of how we do the preaching. If you're going to start with a multi-site in which the site is going to do on-site all live preaching, you'll probably choose a different model. We were doing one in which I was preaching about 80% of the time, and it was video. Now we've switched that a little bit. I still preach about 70 or 80% of the time, but now with enough staff, I manuscript. A number of my co-workers use my manuscript, alter it a little bit, and we do probably 50% live preaching, but still it's 70 or 80% of what I write. That keeps the DNA the same. We also do something that I would never change. We have at Wausau Day, every Tuesday, every staff person comes here all day. It's a non-negotiable. And we have a couple hours together, but we're in the building together all day. And that has kept us really unified. It's kept us so that we actually like one another quite a bit. And it allows the DNA between right now 4 campuses, probably soon to be 5. It allows the DNA to be the same. A few things that we want to ask ourselves, we felt was really important before we did a multi-site. First, have we bathed this in prayer, and is God really in it? I think that's really important. And some of us pastors are doers, and it's really easy to just go and do it rather than to ask the Lord, is this what you want us to do? So I've taken that very seriously because I could easily get ahead of what the Lord wants me to do and just go charging down the street. I kind of need to remind myself of who leads this church. It's the Lord that leads the church. And sometimes I've gotten a little arrogant and have usurped that. I don't want to do that. The second thing I want to remind myself is this a real need? So we have kept our multi-sites geographically far enough that people could drive here, but the unchurched won't. So that's kind of our criteria. We find that the church might drive 45 and 50 minutes. That's a lot. Most people don't, but some of the church will drive a long way. The unchurched, the unredeemed, they're not going to do that. So for us, it's been about 15, 18 minutes between our campus sites. How you set up the multi-site really matters. You all know that, but it's just true. For us, we do still about 50% video, 50% live. I want them to be connected to me. I do. I'm not the pastor even at the church that I'm here all day. We have a campus pastor here in Wausau. I'm not it. We've done that very purposefully so that I could be the senior pastor of all of them. I physically do travel to all of them. Just a little tip for you guys who have young families. We decided right from day one when I traveled, my family would not. Now we're empty nesters, but we have grandchildren. They still don't travel. So my wife is always in the same building. She can be in the same Sunday school class. My kids could be in the same Sunday school class. We found that it was more disruptive to our family if they traveled than not. Now, at one time, my son would say, Dad, I want to go with you. Sure. And he did actually travel a lot with me, but it was just because I was his buddy. But we wanted all of our kids to be grounded in one site, and people respected that. They'd say, oh, your family's on here? I said, oh, no, my family needs to be in Sunday school together. Oh, yeah, that's right, Pastor. And they would see that as a good thing. So how you set it up, if it's like us, I do the majority of the preaching, then that really dictates who I'm looking for as campus pastor. So the last one we did in Merrill, we started with 2 pastors. From day one, we started with a pastor who is a really gifted musician and also has history as a youth pastor. And we started with another pastor who loves children and teaching Bible study. Don't know how we got them. They're absolutely perfect. One of them actually grew up in that community, went to Trinity Seminary, came back, and he was the hardest person I ever got a resume from because his parents attend, his aunt and uncles attend, 3 of his married sisters attend. How do you say no to that? He was a shoo-in. He could have been a disaster. I was hiring him, wasn't I? But he isn't a disaster. He's great. But had we wanted someone who is a dominant preacher, neither of these guys would have been who we hired. So what kind of multi-site you're thinking of will dictate who you hire. We have a unified staff. Even though we have staff that are assigned to each campus, literally all of our pastors and our directors, that would be about 24 individuals, will rotate a little bit. We want that. We want the staff from the satellites to come back here so they stay connected with what we're doing. We want to go there so we can see what is going on. We have 4 pastors that have large worship roles, worship pastors. They rotate. We have 3 youth pastors. They rotate. We have 3 or 4 children pastors. They rotate. Now they only rotate about 20 or 30% of the time, but they rotate so that we can stay connected with one another. We actually have a unified phone system. So our 4 campuses are all in one phone system, which saves a whole lot of money because everything goes through the office I'm at here and can directly go to any of the other campuses. It's expensive to start up. It's really cheap to maintain. And now you have one receptionist rather than 4. We also do all the bulletins here, but each campus has a separate page because though our DNA is the same, they might do different things. And so we have a unified one-page bulletin and a one-page separate for each campus. We do unified training. So if we're training Generation 180, that's our youth group. It meets at multiple sites. All the training is at one site. All of our children's training is at one site. Our security team is all trained at one site. So we do one set of training between the campuses. People will travel for a few training sessions, even if it's a little bit distant. We do a unified budget. Actually, the campus I'm at funds the other 3 campuses. We do. We have a very large amount of overage at the campus I'm at. Certainly in one of the towns that we're in, a 900-person town that's we are the only evangelical church in it. That will never be self-supporting. Runs 100 people, but 100 people that could not support the church. We're good with that. In fact, you now know something that only the elders know, because we have never said to the campuses they have to be self-sufficient. So in our budget, we have a unified budget, but then each one has a breakout budget that they have to honor, but it's only in what is expended. It's not in what we expect them to bring in. Now that's unique to us. It might not be the situation that you have, but for us, we clearly have an area that is much more affluent than the areas we are reaching out to. And so by God's grace, that works for us. You've got to understand or think through who owns property. If you go into a multi-site situation, we own all of our properties, but we would not say that the main campus owns them. We would say all the campuses own all of the property. That is, Highland owns it all. Some multi-sites, that's not the case. Some of my friends have multi-sites where each campus owns the note, or in our case, we don't have any notes, we don't have any debt, but the deed, that is uniformly owned by Highland. You would have to think through. That's important for us because if we were ever to divide, we would hand the note over. We don't want somebody to own their own note and they can choose to divide. As a group, as a church, we could divide. We didn't want to empower any one of the 4 campuses to break off, to succeed. One of my good friends, Brian Berg at Woodlands, had a multi-site with Dan DeRoshi, another one of my good friends at Rapids. They did divide. And it actually was easy for them to divide because each site owned its own deed. The original campus wasn't real happy that succession took place. I think if they were to redo it, they would not have allowed each site to own their own deed. I think they would have unified it, and that would have kept the 2 free churches, good free churches, but it would have kept them as one. Today, they're two. You have to think through what ministry programming needs to be the same and what can be different. So we have that written out very clearly, what you have to do to be in Highland and what you can do or not do to be in Highland. That is a clearly delineated area. So for us, we have a unified elder board. They have determined what you must do on your campus. Each campus has its own little board. They can determine the other things. So to give you an example, we run Sunday school. We have hundreds and hundreds, maybe more than that, in Sunday school. That's mandated. But what you teach, it's not mandated. We have parameters, but each campus can decide how to do it. So we have one elder board. We have one mission committee. We have one set of what you might call deacons and deaconesses. We have a different name for it. Let's see, what else do we do? We loan out worship leaders. We loan out musicians to one another so that if a church is lacking some musicians or a site is lacking, we'll send someone else. We have one set of insurance. We have one 501c3. These are not always true for multi-sites. You have to think through how you want to do it. One of the things we have done, right or wrong, is we only do soft launches. So with our first one in Weston, we actually ran church for 6 months before we ever let the public know it. And then when we let the public know it, all we did was open the doors. We didn't advertise. That's just philosophically, we really don't advertise. We ask our congregation to invite their neighbors. But we wanted to practice for 6 months, making sure that our nurseries were adequate, that we understood how to run Pro Presenter, all of that. We did that on ourselves rather than invite our community, so that when we were up and running, whatever standard our community thinks Highland has, we wanted to match it. I think that is important for us. It might be important for you. There's likely that your community thinks of your church at a certain standard, and I would guess it's very high. And so when you launch, you probably want to be pretty close to that. That takes a little bit of practice on yourself so that we're not kind of practicing on the newbies and we make a mess of it and they never come back. A couple key considerations, I think, before you go forward. You have to have staff unity. You have to have elder unity. You have to have financial cushion, because this multi-site is not paying for itself anytime soon. The best I've ever seen is 18 months. I have a number of friends who do multi-sites. At 18 months, several of them have been self-sufficient. So you need some financial cushion. You need some organizational capacity. You really do. You can't be just at the edge of your limitation and then do a multi-site. And you need to define what success looks like. For us, it's not noses and nickels, but for us, success would look like people are coming to a saving knowledge of Christ, and we have a discipleship model in which they're growing up in Christ. So those are the things that I thought I would share. I'll be happy to send you my notes. I also have a very large section on mergers, because we've done that as well. But mergers are a little different and a lot trickier than a multi-site. I'll just say one thing on a merger, because we've done 2 of them. If you do a merger, it's at least $10,000 of legal fees, at least. And don't try a merger without it. Unless you have a lawyer looking into the past of who you want to merge with, you might find some nasty things later on. For instance, when we did one merger, we discovered that they had never incorporated. They were not a 501c3 ever. And in Wisconsin, we legally had to incorporate them, cost us money, and then we had to unincorporate them. Okay, that's minor. But in that particular church, they also had an abusive pastor. If we had not legally closed them down and some accusations of sex abuse, which did come out, we would have been liable for that because they would have been us. We legally shut them down. We shut the church down for a few weeks, legally started it up as another entity, Highland. We are not responsible for whatever happened in that building prior to us owning it. So if you're going to do a merger, make sure you have a lawyer who is an expert in this area, or it could get kind of nasty. Well, Mike said that you all could ask some questions. If you have some, I'll do the best I can.
All right. So do you have any questions that have come up, maybe from your own context or just as he was talking about what they're doing? I mean, I have a couple myself, but I'm going to let other people join in first. So if you just have some thoughts, what's great is that Jeff has thought through a lot of these things. And so I've appreciated already in previous conversation that, you know, he is somebody who has done some research, plus he's got the experience. There's a couple things you said today that I'm like, oh, okay, you're right. I probably need to consider that. So anybody have a question for him?
Jeff, I had a question. I apologize. I had to step away. And so if you already said this, I apologize. But I guess from the philosophical standpoint of why multi-site and why not just send a pastor, plant a church in that aspect?
That's a great question. I'm going to answer that one tonight when we meet with another group. We do get involved in church planting. So we're involved right now in 2 church plants, one a Hispanic and one a multicultural, mostly in support financially and support in terms of some maybe experience. But the average church plant in America has a little less than a 50% success rate. Right now, the average multi-site has a little over 90% success rate. So 5 years from now, 9 out of 10 multi-sites will still exist. Less than 5 out of 10 church plants will exist. So from a purely practical point of view, one seems to have a better success rate. The other thing I would say is this, and this is one of the arguments I'm going to make tonight with this other church, because we're going to try and make a new model, and I'm excited about it. But it is very easy for me as a pastor to watch the biggest donor of Highland. I don't even know who that is, but to watch the biggest donor go to one of my other sites. Who cares? It's a little more painful and a little more difficult to watch the biggest donor go to the church plant just down the road, or the musician, or the gifted whatever. I have found that I'm rather generous with multi-sites because we're all one. The other thing that I have seen that is really valuable is we have the ability to have some specialists work at all 4 campuses that if we were 4 different churches, we probably none of us could afford the specialist. And that's really been advantageous to us. The fact that for most weeks we write 1 sermon rather than having 4 people write a sermon just saves a lot of time. We do the same thing with youth group. We have 1 lesson that's used in multiple sites. We do the same thing in children's church. We're writing 1 bulletin. We're insuring 4 buildings with one insurer, which is a lot cheaper than 4 churches insuring 4 buildings. So the economy of scale for us has been really large. So those are kind of the reasons that we have found the multi-site to be effective. One of the other things is, like the community of 900 that we're in, a really good church planner wouldn't go into that community. It is 90% Roman Catholic. So we got one evangelical church running about 100 people that's not self-sufficient. The rest of the community, literally, I'm not exaggerating, is Roman Catholic. It's kind of the place where a good church planner would go to die, because they wouldn't be able to support themselves. And they might feel very defeated. As a multi-site, it's not the case. They're part of our staff. We rotate a little bit. They get some relief in other settings. And we do a lot as a staff, literally, very close as a staff. So there's support that I think a church planter might not feel. So those are some of my points.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Sure.
Anybody else have a question?
Yes, I have a million questions, but we don't have time for that. So I'll start with 1 or 2. How's that? Where we're at it, because it's so rural, like our community is 8,000, the other 2 are about 1,000 people each. We started without any campus pastor. We had an internal person that we sort of gave the mantle of leader, but we also they said they weren't comfortable with being the pastor or the spiritual head, so to speak. So we're sort of juggling that amongst our staff, and they're just sort of the logistical and communication lead, which it was probably not ideal, but it's what we needed to do. What we're struggling with is with 45 people as regular attenders and very committed to the campus. We can't afford to hire a full-time person. But so how do we create that spiritual leadership, that intentional disciple-making leader at those campuses? Do we bring someone up from inside, which we've considered? I've discipled several folks from each of those campuses, and none of them feel equipped or called to do that. Bring someone from the outside, which I can tell you, moving out here, not many folks want to move out here. And so, you put out that job search, you're going to get a whole lot of very little in terms of applicants. And so we're really kind of at this place where we know we need leadership, and we're struggling to figure out how we do that. What input might you have for us on helping us give us good direction on that?
Well, I make 2 comments. First, I really believe in internal hires. We have some external hires, but again, the success rate of an external hire is about 50%. The success rate of an internal hire is definitely north of 80 and might even be 90%. I also would be thinking, if I had 2 campuses of 45 people, I'd be thinking of, could I hire somebody 3/4 of the time or whatever can be afforded, and they're rotating. I really love the fact that our staff rotates. I think our staff really loves the fact that they rotate. Our congregation gets to put names with people. So you might not be able to hire somebody at a 45 and a 45, and those communities may never get to the point of supporting one person, but together they might be able to, if you have a unified budget. And I wouldn't even say, if we hired them there for those 2, I'd just hire one more staff person as soon as I could and start to rotate them. So a couple thoughts.
I'm going to follow up on that question, because it's something that I'm wondering about staffing. This is actually a question we're going to be discussing as an elder board here. And you say internal hires. Do you do like raise people up then, like residencies, or how do you do that? How do you bring them on in the first place? Do they just come up from within the church? What is it that you're doing to get those folks?
Well, I've been here almost 20 years. So some of our internal hires were in our one-way club and our youth group. So yeah, we did raise them up. They often went off to Bible college. Some of them went to seminary. Actually, a fair number of them went to seminary. And then we knew right away we were going to hire them. So we didn't pretend we weren't. One thing I would say about internal hires is we never advertise, ever. We're either going externally or we're going externally and tapping one person internally. But I had a very bad experience in a prior church where my elders made me advertise. I think I know why. 2 of those elders applied. We didn't hire either one, which really was a very uncomfortable life for me. So I just will never advertise, even for, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way, but even for somebody who's in an administrative role or in a cleaning role, we just have always our antenna out as to who's got our DNA and who's got the attitude and work ethic that we're looking for. I'm really convinced that we can train people to do most roles. I can't change attitude. I can't change work ethic. So I look for people who I think are really good workers. We're all in rural communities. I'll be honest. I look for farm kids. They learned how to work. So a lot of my farm kids have, I can train them theologically. We pay for their theological education here. They're on staff and they go to seminary if we want them to. That's not a huge deal. I look for farm kids because I don't have to teach them how to work. They get up and they work. I don't know if I answered your question or not.
That's very good. Thank you. Anybody else? I know, Jeff, you had others, but anybody else have a question? We've got about 10 minutes left with Jeff Hines.
Yeah, I got a question.
Okay.
This model sounds great. I love what you're doing, and I see some commonalities and differences with other multi-site churches. But your model certainly tends to a church that has the extra funds and has already a large size. But we're also considering how would smaller churches
Absolutely
do this that don't have all the same luxuries that you've been able to work from. We don't want to create a model of church planting that only large churches can do, only churches that are really in financial good straits. I mean, how do you just downscale this?
Well, we weren't always as large as we are. So we just stuck with the same principles that we would do what we could afford to do. But one of the things we're doing with another church tonight is we're purposely meeting with an elder board of a church that is never multi-site, doesn't have the financial means to multi-site. It's actually going to be 50 minutes from us and like 5 minutes from them. I'll be honest, there's 10 of us. We're going to fund the whole thing. We're going to bring multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund it. But this is what I want to try and do. And this is what we're trying to do. We want to demonstrate that 2 churches, one that's not large enough to multi-site, and the other we'll just pretend that we need help. We don't with them. But we want to see if 2 churches together, both free churches, can multi-site together with the idea that so much of Wisconsin is rural. We want to show that 2 small churches could pool their resources and have one multi-site together that reaches a community that might not attract a church planter. That's what we're actually setting out to do. Now, we're a bad model of that because we could do it on our own. but we want to demonstrate the camaraderie of two churches so that other churches in our community that could not do it on their own could say, you know what, if we did it with another church, we could share a multi-site. So obviously we have to agree on what it looks like. We have to agree on who owns the documents. In this case, we're going to allow the multi-site to own all the documents in case we can't be nice to one another. But I think that's a possibility, is that two rural churches, neither of which could do it themselves, might be able to do it together. In our case, the senior pastor is a very close friend of mine. I think that helps because our friendship is also on the line.
Thanks.
All right. Anybody else?
In the deafening silence, I'll ask one more. One of the multi-sites that I'm familiar with, they specifically do not rotate. There are different leaders that they have for their own reasons. And I understand the reasons why you're doing yours. What downsides do you see to rotating the staff?
The only downside I might see is that a few of our staff, most of our staff are young. We have purposely hired much younger. I'm 56. I am the third oldest pastor. Everyone else is 40s, 30s, and 20s. I think there is a little bit of a challenge for some of our young families to have to rotate a little bit, the husband, or in some cases the directors, the wives, leaving. I think that's a little bit of a challenge. But otherwise, I think our staff really, really likes the rotation. If they didn't, they wouldn't have to. They all do.
Thanks.
Dave, I'm going to go ahead. Jeff, why don't you go ahead? Jeff Dunlin, you have other questions? Because I'll let you go ahead and ask one then.
Yeah, so as you're thinking through your budgeting, and you said you have one budget, which we do as well, how do you, as you're then delineating each campus's budget, are you taking things like kids ministry, and within kids ministry you have 4 sites, or are you saying we have kids ministry for this site, that site, that site, and that site, but it's all within one budget? So how are you constructing the budget within that unification?
Kids ministry is all one budget. Youth is all one budget. Salaries are all one budget. What tends to be broken out are specific administrative costs or ministry costs to that campus that we're not doing at all 4. So if we're doing something at all 4, it is one budget item. If it's unique to that campus, that is in that campus. So if you look at the campuses, their budgets look ridiculously small, but it's not really true because we're covering all the salaries in one area. All of our one-way clubs, which is like our version of Awana or whatever, that's all unified. It doesn't show up in their budgets, but what's unique to them, what we can hold them accountable for, is in their budget. The truth is, how we do ministry, I couldn't hold each campus accountable for worship. I couldn't, but I could hold them accountable for the equipment for worship at each campus. So the equipment is in their budget. All of our worship costs, I can't, because all subscriptions we share, CCLI licenses we share, worship pastors we share. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And that's more or less what we have done as well. So yeah, like things like the rent and the specific equipment things are all the things that are parsed out in ours. Otherwise, everything else is unified. As I'm thinking on the staff question is for me, my biggest consumer of my thoughts right now, my stressors with this. We are really unique in that we're a church of 450 people, and we don't have a worship pastor. We never have. In our 40-year history of church, we've never had one. We have 9 staff, but we're really pretty lean, I think, in that way. And I keep asking myself what would be like that next step in terms of staffing. And you have said that you really lean heavily on the worship side, which obviously we don't. And our campuses are unique in that one of the campuses has the Partridge family that goes to it. And so they do their own music and stream the rest of the service. We have another campus that can't carry a tune in a bucket. And so they stream the whole thing. And they just have a campus, one of the core team members get up and give announcements and sort of the welcome and that sort of thing. And so I'm trying to think of like where our next hire, like your suggestion of a rotation. So if I were to say, okay, we're going to hire a position, it's going to be a third, and a third of what, or what, however. I'm trying to figure out where we have a heavy emphasis on disciple making. And so really, like if I could design my perfect campus pastor, it'd be somebody that just knows how to make disciples and just meets with people all day and is a great connections, disciple making person. Like that's it. That's all I need them to do. Can you help me maybe sort through my philosophy difference from yours or similarities, and where worship or hiring maybe a position I haven't thought about, like our tech person, he's great at tech, but it's 100% volunteer, and he volunteers like a part-time job to what we do, like those sort of things. I'm trying to think through that, and maybe that's a better question for one-on-one and not this group setting. But
I'll make 2 comments. First, I love that you're a disciple making church. So are we. We are all about disciples. We really don't count noses, nickels. We're very far away from a seeker sensitive or seeker driven model.
Yep.
We just are. But I would make this comment for all of us, and I want to remind myself of this. I don't want to hire doers. I only want to hire equippers. So whatever role I want, and one of the problems with worship pastors, they're wonderful, love them, is they tend to be doers. They tend to be performers. Not that they are arrogant, they're doers. I don't want that. If I'm hiring a worship pastor, I want someone who probably is in key. That would be nice, but who will multiply themselves. So whatever position I'm looking for, it's always an equipper. I don't want doers. And that really has helped me a great deal in terms of who I'm looking for. If they can't reproduce themselves multiple times, then they're the wrong hire. Frankly, if I can't reproduce myself multiple times, I'm the wrong hire. Because the Ephesians 4 model is to equip the laity to do works of ministry. And I think we all say that, but we want to do that. So whatever area you're looking for, it's got to be equippers.
Well, it is 2:30, and Jeff has much wisdom that I'm sure we could continue to learn from. I'm wondering, Jeff, I'm going to put this together. I've taken some notes. I'm not sure who else has taken some notes. I'll make those available. If you have some notes and can send them to me, then I'll go ahead and make that available to folks. I'm also wondering, somebody like Jeff Dunlin there in McCook, whether you might be available to connect with personally for people who are right in the middle of it, that are
Sure,
doing it.
I'd be honored.
I mean, I love your attitude of just, resourcing the church. And so, Scott Sterner, one of the district up there.
Can't get the volume. The volume isn't coming up for me,
Okay, hang on just a second, Dave. I'll get it for a second.
and I can't hear.
So I will go ahead and make sure that your information is out there. If somebody wants to connect with you more personally, and I guess you can decide on the timing on that. So can I pray for you here real quick, and then we're going to try to get Dave fixed.
Perfect. What I'll just say before you pray is I'll send it to you, Mike, my notes, and I'll also put my email address just below it. If you forward that, they would have the notes that I just talked off of, and they could have the email address if in some way a conversation would be beneficial. So, thanks.
All right, that sounds good. Let me pray for you then. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you for this time. I really just thank you for the way you have gifted Jeff, and as he is using his gifts both locally and helping us to learn and grow. And we desire for your church to go forward and the kingdom to grow and disciples to be made and multiplied, and churches and campuses and whatever that looks like in our context to go forward. I pray that you would help us to understand and listen to you. I pray that you would help Jeff, even today, even tonight, as he goes into this meeting, that you would bring a great agreement, and that there would be new ways of doing things, and perhaps we can bring it back in a couple of years, and he would even have more understanding of how churches can continue to go forward in these areas. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. It's nice to meet you all.
Necessary, but so let me just describe real quick the context, how I actually heard about Dave, and then he can describe more what their church is doing there. Dave is in Devil's Lake, North Dakota. He actually knows my dad. My dad pastored 40 miles to the northwest there, up in a little town called Candu, at a church. It was a Church of the Brethren, although he was still affiliated with the E-Free. My dad was ordained in the E-Free as well. And so Devil's Lake is the big town around there. It's got what, maybe 6,000. Is that right, Dave?
Yeah, 7,500
Oh,
about.
so it's grown. I see.
It's
Since I
grown,
was there.
yes.
Like the lake, the town has grown, right?
Yeah.
So I actually went and lived in North Dakota in Candu for 2 winters. I don't know why I was there for the winter, but I was there for 2 winters. So I experienced 44 below real temperature. So that was my, but they are doing something a little different. They've done it for a number of years, where rather than doing campuses, they have a ministry to some satellite smaller churches. And Dave is their, I don't know, rural church pastor. Is that what it's called?
Yes, I'm the pastor of Rural Church Care.
Okay. So Dave, why don't you go? I'm just going to let you go for it then. Describe what you're doing there, and I'll, take some notes. And
okay, I'll
give
you
questions for you guys.
I'll start with a little bit of history.
Okay.
14 plus years ago, there was an interim pastor in Esmond, North Dakota at Bethany E-Free.
Okay.
And great interim pastor. Him and Bruce Dick was our senior pastor here in Devil's Lake. And Bruce was working on his DMin. And they got talking, and the church in Esmond, it was fairly vital. And they had a very, very heavy heart for missions. And so they decided that they would like to look at our pattern for this rural church care operation. And it's worked wonderful. We've been with them for 13 plus years now. And also with Grace City, which is a smaller church. And now I'm with Pheasanton, which is not an E-Free church. It's more of an independent congregation. And I spent 9 months working with the E-Free church in New Rockford, North Dakota. Now, what we looked at was what kind of leadership in the different congregations. Do they have leaders that can keep the church together and lead a service, because my contract puts me there once a month minimum. I do the funerals, I do the weddings, visitation. If there's somebody that's homebound, hospital bound, I do the visitation and so forth. But in that interim time, we need good leaders in a congregation. And the other thing is, most or all of these churches are the only evangelical footprint in the area. So looking at them and trying to figure out if they're on hospice or if there's some vitality. If there's vitality, it has worked wonderful. Now, New Rockford did find a young man out of Oak Hills Bible College, and they hired him as pastor 10 years ago, which has worked out very well for them. And the thing, if you would look at a pattern like this, you'd need someone that could interact with multiple communities. Now, I'm not Joe Perfect by any means. I love people. I love the gospel. I love to share the word of God. And for instance, it took more than a year to really be embraced at the first church, at the church in Esmond. And I think there was some suspicion, some cautious feelings. Well, then they made me a member of the board. So I'm a member of their board. I vote with them. I interact with them. When I'm there, I'll lead a service. I do communion for them every time I'm there. And it takes good leadership from the base, and it takes good leadership from the congregations that are joining or participating in. This rural church ministry it's been wonderful. I've enjoyed it so much, and yeah, I've hurt with the people when they've had pain, when they've had losses in the congregation. There are some things that are very hard when, a member that hasn't been there for 40 years passes away in Seattle and they bring him back and there's no relatives, and how do you do a funeral? So you have to do a lot of digging, but it's been very, very, very exciting. I have to say that my experience has been more than worthwhile going out, and I put a lot of miles on. The Pheasanton Church is the furthest away. That's 67 miles. Esmond is 50 miles. Grace City is 62 miles. And I contacted other churches. There was one in Glenfield that I contacted, and it was great promise. But a pastor came along and said, no, that won't work for you. Well, they're in the process of finding the third pastor that's been there since we tried the rural church thing for them. But these things are not real simple. The most difficult part that I see is crossing denominational lines. Are we spooky or something? Do we offend people just by being there, or what's the deal? Now, my wife comes from a long Lutheran background. She was originally ALC, and they were very evangelical. They had evangelists come in, preach revival. I mean, she watched her folks go 1950 to the altar to make a decision for Jesus. And so it's like, it's not something that's real simple, but boy, this has worked really well now. We live stream now. We used to do DVD. We would send a DVD out and it'd be one week behind. And that worked good for a long time. They just needed a projector and and a computer to play it. And no, now it's all live stream. Everything seems to be working well. I'm trying the church in Pheasanton, I'm trying to get them, they're independent, and they're a little scattered. When I say scattered, I mean they're faithful, but they just don't know which way to go. I know that one of the members has been a Nazarene, but he's more leaning, they want to maybe go to the Baptist convention. But I'm trying to get them interested in participating in the Evangelical Free Association of Congregations. And I think I've been there 1 year now, and I think that the recognition is starting to play. It's starting to come around. North Dakota is almost like Missouri. You know, you have to kind of check it out before it happens. But all in all, boy, it's been good. Some of the things, like my comment about a church in hospice. There's a church about 30 miles from here that I've worked for 3 years to try to get into. And they pretty much shut the doors. They'll have a service once a month or once every other month, but they seem reluctant to do anything else. Now, taking into consideration, it's an old congregation, and it takes a little bit of work to even promote the rural church care that we do, and they need to participate. And right now, it seems like they really don't want to do much, but come every once in a while and hear a message and then go home. So that probably would not work well. One thing I would ask each one of you, if you've had interaction with other denominations, what's the secret? How does this happen? I was in Fort Worth 3-4 years ago. We were doing a revival in Fort Worth and Dallas, Fort Worth, 4,700 churches. In Fort Worth, there was a Baptist church on every corner. And if I could connect with a pastor or the congregation, they thought we were sheep stealing. And we were there to build their congregation, not to do anything for any other church. But it's hard to get credibility sometimes. But I would welcome any questions that you would have.
Well, Dave, I'm going to try to have some establishing questions, because you missed a little bit of what we were doing with Jeff Hines earlier. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you come on here, because you're presenting something so much different. And yet what you're doing is actually very similar to what Oglala is doing. They, out in Western Nebraska, they have a congregation they're providing services, pastoral services to, I think 90 miles away down in Colorado. And so, you know, especially in these very disparate rural areas, Western Kansas, Western Nebraska, there may be places where instead of planting a new church, instead we're helping keep an evangelical witness alive in a community that it otherwise wouldn't survive in. And or there might be something kind of like what you're talking about. And I'm not sure I have an answer, but I'm just thinking of the fact that it might be an evangelical church that's not an E-free church right now, but we still have that opportunity to then go into that community and help them in some way. And so the fact that you guys have been doing this for so long.
This would be the Church of the Rock in Pheasanton.
Mm-hmm.
They were Calvary Chapel at one time, or that's how they started. But sure. Now they're totally independent, but a evangelical witness, absolutely.
So what is the relationship, and I guess what your personal relationship with the Devil's Lake Church And also then, how do these satellite churches view the base church there in Bethel, there in Devil's Lake?
Well, I'm on staff here at Bethel. Currently, we have 3 pastors, youth and music, and a senior pastor. And I'm the pastor of Rural Church Care. Plus, I get the overflow from the other pastors. Nursing home. I do a nursing home service every Monday morning. Nursing home 3-4 blocks from here, and it's like we try to have a meeting with all the rural churches. I like to have it more than twice a year, where we all get together, we talk about the events, we talk about how things are working. Now, the one church, the building is very bright inside, and when we'd have the scripture on the wall, it had a light background and white letters. So we had to accommodate them because it was hard for them to read the scripture. So we try to make accommodations that fit for each congregation. And I'll tell you what, I have developed relationships with people in each one of these congregations, and it has been wonderful. Now, everybody doesn't do everything perfect. There's always going to be maybe a misunderstanding here or there, but you know what? You just take care of it right away, and make things go. So I think I've been accepted pretty well, and I think the church here has been accepted pretty well. And we have charged for the services according to the size of the numbers of people that are in attendance. We try to make a decision what would be a fair charge for the services.
And you have a contract, is that correct? Then did you write a contract with? So each church is independent.
Yes.
And then you have a contract with them?
We have a contract that they can get out of anytime they want to. But the contract states that we will bring messages that are consistent with the Evangelical Free Church. Not something off the wall, not anything different than what would be consistent with Evangelical Free Church.
Where did you get the contracts themselves? Like, I mean, I got one from you, and where did you develop that? Was that something that somebody else was doing? You have any idea what the history of the contracts was?
Bruce Dick developed that contract. Him and I talked about it, and he wrote it up, and it's been well received.
I'll let anybody else ask questions of Dave then.
Dave, were any of these churches started from scratch?
Once upon a time.
Well, no, I mean, as part of this model.
No, not really.
Okay.
The church in Pheasanton is probably the newest church. It's in the old Nazarene church building, and it started about 6 years ago, I believe. And they've had a lot of ups and downs. They had a pastor that fell from good standing and had to move away, and they've had some not so good leadership, but it's coming around. There's a couple new elders with a lot of promise. So I think
I'm sorry. Do you see the capacity to start a church from scratch under this model?
it very well could. Location would be what's really strange in North Dakota, and maybe not in your district either. In our district, people think church, they think of a building. I've seen a lot of churches meet in a gymnasium or in a high school auditorium or in a, different places and begin and build. But in North Dakota, it's like a building. Where's the building? And we know, and forgive me for maybe undermining anything, but I think we're going to see a lot more of house churches growing and prospering, as long as we can have a congregation that is willing to stay together. That the one church in Esmond, Bethany, they have a minimum of 5 excellent leaders. 70% of their funds go to the mission field. And I mean, they do a right nice job there. And so that is exciting to see, and interact with agencies in the communities. They work with the ambulance service, with the fire department. They support the cafe. I mean, it's like, most of these small towns, the cafes are just subsidized because it's hard to make a living on a free owned cafe. But yeah, it's I think it could start, a church could start that way.
One of the things that I think, even what you talked about in Pheasanton there, that I really could see is if there were a group of people, and I'm thinking Bill Carey's congregation, if there were a group of lay people already in a community of this size, that they could not probably ever develop, or have the capacity to have an independent pastor, hire their own pastor. But if we had churches that were willing to, like Devil's Lake, had networks set up for this near them, that might be a way to start a congregation from a group of people that was already interested. And I agree, Dave, that's as I perceive something like this in some of the smaller towns, especially the ones, like North Dakota, Western Nebraska. I perceive that there may be places where some of these models might be, that's why having a couple of different ways of thinking about it might work. Rather than saying it has to be a campus, what Jeff presented earlier, they're very unified campus. They're all under the same church heading. But if there were, people in a community that they wanted their own church, but you could provide services for them. So
I had a thought kind of passed through my mind here, because I'm getting old and I forget some things. But this is not a huge financial endeavor. You don't have to put out a lot of money. And when we started, we had one projector that we would loan these churches to receive the messages and put them on. Some of the criteria is having a life-size screen and having a good sound system in the church. Now, a good sound system in the church, sometimes it's the microphone by the computer, but it has worked. And as things progressed, they have purchased better equipment. Now, 2 of the churches have 2 projectors. The Esmond Church, it kind of comes together in a point, and so they have wall on the left and wall on the right, and they have 2 projectors. The message is presented. It's just, it doesn't have to be a costly thing to start up. And these projectors are getting more reasonable.
do they have their own worship times? Is that what you've said, that they have their own worship times?
Yes, we encourage that. They can use Bethel's worship time. However, we don't have the professional sound equipment to be able to broadcast that in a very, very good way. They will sometimes join with Bethel's worship, but generally, they have their own.
And then how does that work with, like, if you're live streaming the sermon? I mean, you just have a specific start time. They know the sermon is going to start at this time. So like on the Bethel side of things, do you have to?
Well, they know what time it's supposed to start. However, they can hold that back. So they can do the catch up. For instance, if their worship time went beyond Bethel's worship time, they would just start the sermon when they were done. And it's also able to be recaptured later. You can go to the website and pick up that sermon, either audio or visual, anytime you want to. So even people that are at home, we had just a short period of time last year where we closed the churches because of the COVID and all this stuff. But when we started back, it was like, hey, we're just going forward. We probably started with 25-30%, but the rural churches were at 100%. They were in all the way. So, and in both Esmond and Grace City, they have wonderful musicians. I mean, great musicians they sing like you wouldn't believe. These old country churches, they want to sing those hymns, and it goes well. Sometimes maybe Bethel's a little bit on the modern side, the worship is, hey, I'm an old man. I remember the good old days. I hear that often. What about the good old songs, But it works well.
All right. Anybody else have questions? Okay, Jeff.
So we approached a smaller church in another community about sharing their facility, and that went over like screen doors in a submarine. It was just not going to be an option at all. Like they had no interest in working with us at all. And then we have another denomination in our area that has 3 open churches. When I say open, I mean they have no pastor at the moment, and within about an hour, probably roughly, radius of us. And we actually kind of interesting connection. We're hiring a former pastor of theirs, so I ended up talking to the district superintendent for that denomination as a reference, and he was telling me how they were struggling to get pastors. And I told him, I said, well, we stream our services and we have campuses, and this would be something we would be willing to talk through what this might look like. But I want to be very respectful of those denominational lines. And he wasn't offended or anything, but he hasn't called me back either. I just didn't know what, now, especially with this new pastor we're hiring who has these connections in with this denomination. Do you have any pointers or direction you would send us on how to establish good relationships up front so that even this sort of thing would be a possibility?
Very, very carefully, very carefully. Try, you have a real good option there with the pastor that had been formerly in those, at least one of those churches anyway. But you need to sit down and have a cup of coffee with a few people from the congregation. Say the chairman of the congregation, say an elder or two, or a family, and just sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk to them and ask them what would they really like. You see, if it's what they really like, it's okay. You won't find that rejection, but there is points that people will reject. I don't see why, but they may. So you want to try to, you have to be a little smooth. You have to be a good salesman. The gospel is worth it. The gospel is worth putting enough effort into whatever it takes to cause a good relationship. If a good relationship takes 2-3 months, it's very well worth it. If it's not going to fly, I'll tell you what, you'll know it right away. Are these congregations, do they have vitality? That's kind of the biggest issue that I deal with, is if there's some vitality in the community, in the area, yeah, then do whatever it takes to get things rolling.
And what we found out here is their biggest struggle is qualified preachers, so to speak, someone who can preach and is qualified in terms of training to preach. The care aspects, like they're happy to do that care for themselves. It's just they can't find somebody who can preach. And that's one advantage we found with our multi-site model of streaming, is you really only have to hire one preacher, so to speak. And so, but that they don't see it that way up front. Now, like you said, if I just had one short conversation, so if I went and actually spent some time with some of those folks, maybe
it takes time. It takes time. And one of the things that we did to begin with is we did an interview with the senior pastor and put it on a DVD, and a couple of sermons that he had recorded, or we had recorded of him, that would indicate quality and so forth for a message. Yeah. Do you have a leader in your congregation that would be interested in being the outrider? That's a big thing to grab. You see, I volunteered when I heard this was coming. When I talked to Bruce, I volunteered, and I felt called to the ministry 50 years ago. And my wife looked at me and she said, "Nope, I can't be a pastor's wife. I've seen too many pastors' wives that have had too much put on them. I can't do that." Well, then I did pulpit fill for 50 years without being attached as a full-time pastor. But yeah, it's a time and a building of relationships that makes the difference. So we probably had 6 months with the Esmond Church, with the interim pastor and the congregation. And of course, we've known some of these people for years, but hadn't been that close. So.
In
Anyway.
rural ministry, clearly that's the case, when especially those small towns, that's, I'm sure so much of it is trust built in relationship like that. So.
And believe me, you get to know who makes the best cookies. You get to know who has them on hand all the time. And so you just kind of, hey, I'm in the area, I'm going to stop by and visit. And it works well. It works very well.
Now, Dave, is there a set goal of autonomy for these churches ever, or is this the goal to have this relationship be ad infinitum? What's the long-term vision?
Whatever they desire.
Okay.
We do not call them a satellite church. Sometimes that term comes up, but we refer to them as their own congregation. They make their own judgments and so forth. There's no further expectations other than if they wanted to start a congregation somewhere else, we would support them.
So based on your contract, it looks like your personal maximum would be about 4 churches that you could personally handle as the old circuit rider kind of pastor. Right
now, that's what it looks like. And, this is year 79, and I'm not quite sure how far I want to stretch this rubber band. It may break in pieces along the way, but yeah, and I have had mules that I rode, and Mike's father's an old horseman, and we share a lot of stories once in a while when we get to talking. But I usually drive my Ford pickup, and come into these communities, and then I'm okay. I wear my cowboy hat and drive my pickup and have a rifle in the pickup all the time. So we make it happen.
Well, again, that just shows me though how God is using, contextualization makes such a difference here. That so in some of our areas, one thing's going to work, but even as Jeff Hines was talking about earlier, to do rural ministry, they're coming from a small city out into smaller towns, but still not as rural as these. But he's talking about how do we do the next level of things. And so some of these his thing is almost sounds like big church, and so we might be able to flow into that. But Dave, what you're talking about is some of the communities even that I'm in, and then certainly you get west of here in western Kansas, it's almost going to have to look like this. And if we could, pick up by helping churches that would be good evangelical churches out there. That's why I wanted to talk about this as well. And I see it happening, Oglala doing it, rather than thinking in traditional church planting model where it has to be an independent church with a pastor on site. If we can help a ministry survive, or, maybe that's a way to start something in the future even. So
thinking through this, the important thing is to keep the church vital in their individual communities and to encourage that vitality. People get tired, and when they're worn out and when they're tired, they really don't want to function. Now, I'm getting half worn out. I keep telling them at the nursing home, make sure there's a chair out there for me, because I'm going to be sitting out there with you here one of these days. But, having that personal get to know people, and listen to their list. One thing we learned here just some years ago is if you don't love, don't go. If you don't listen, don't go. So love, listen, discern, and then speak. And sometimes the speaking is, hey, thank you, George. It was great being with you another day. Could we meet next week for a cup of coffee? Could we talk about this in a week or two? Could you talk to some of your friends and maybe we could have 3 or 4 people for a cup of coffee? So it's a building thing, and it is important to have that character, or that love to see God's church have vitality and be successful in the communities.
thank you.
I have a question. This is Bill Carey. How do you see the cultures? I mean, each church has a bit of its own culture, but in general, just you see enough commonness that it's not an issue? You have to talk about, as pastors, how do you tailor a message to multiple churches, and maybe be careful to not tell a Swedish joke in the middle of a church service or something like that? I mean, it takes a bit of sensitivity. What one church would connect with, another church could be offended by. And I think, even in our church, we've done a lot of streaming, and we used to stream from a congregation in California, which was very good, except they were more of a beachcomber mentality. And so now we're streaming a lot of things from another church that we connect well with, though that's probably a church of several thousand. It's not just rural, but it's a kind of a heart of a church, a mindset within a church. Do you see a problem in that area?
It can be. Fortunately, I had gone to a seminar 40 years ago, a training seminar to bring new pastors into the area. And this was put on by the ALC church. And it was a very wonderful education. Northeast North Dakota is mainly Scandinavian. And you get south of here, and there's a lot of German influence. So, I'll tell them you can tell a German a lot of things, but you can't tell them much. Or the Norwegian, I married a Norwegian. I married that blonde, blue-eyed, wonderful, and she doesn't particularly like lutefisk, but German likes, they can eat anything. But yeah, it can be touchy. I grew up north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in a multi-ethnic community, and Polish on the right, Italians across the street, Hungarians down the street, and I probably busted. I raided every wedding at every one of these communities, and got to know the people. But you had to be careful. You had to be careful about, yeah.
Dave, does your senior pastor then actually think in those terms? Like when I'm preaching, and I was just noticing because, we've gotten to the place where because of COVID, we stretched all the way to the back of the room, and I'm no longer preaching to people that I can see. I mean, there's some of the people are like, they're far enough back that you can't do eye contact with them. Does he then think in terms of, again, that idea that these are people that I'm trying to connect with over in Pheasanton or wherever, when he preaches?
Yes. Now, Bryce Harsey is our senior pastor now, and he's from north of the cities. And he came here, and it's a completely different culture than what he was used to. And he's been here 5.5 years, and it's taken him a little time. And I sit in front of him at his desk periodically, and I said, no, you realize you have to do one thing at a time. And you realize that you have to kind of be cautious and not to offend. We just have a wonderful relationship, and he does a great job with including. Usually at every service, he will mention the other churches. Hey, thanks for being online with us in Esmond and Gray City and Pheasanton. It's a treat to be with you today. And they're functioning at about 100%, and we're functioning right now at 70 plus. So if we will see 200 in our congregation now. And we were really starting to get up there before the COVID thing, but it is all these things are so important. Yeah.
All right. Anybody else have any last questions here? Well, Dave, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to close up today. Can I pray for you guys up there as well?
Please do that. Please,
Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this time together. I thank you for Dave joining us. I pray for Bethel, and just thank you for the ministry that you've given them, really unique ministry, and that he's willing to share his time and his wisdom with us. Pray that you would help us as we go forward to take these ideas, Lord, into our individual contexts and help us to learn and grow. And Lord, as we see your kingdom go forward, help us to make disciples in our communities and in our Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. Pray all these things in Jesus' precious name. Amen.